Hello, everyone. Tonight we relax with a story about a remedy so ancient and dark that even medieval priests shuddered. You walk through the old wooden gate of a village deep in the European forest, where the fog is so thick you can make out faces in it, and one of the first things you hear, again, is an old man whispering, "Here, the dead still heal." You might think that's a metaphor, but no, they're actually talking about dead people, specifically skulls and the moss that grows on them. In many parts of 5th, 10th to 17th century Europe, moss growing on human skulls, especially in church catacombs, was believed to have medicinal properties. They called it by many strange names: moss soul, moss of saints, green hair of purification. But the most popular and quietest name is skullcap. You probably wouldn't survive trying to explain everything with modern science here. Because unlike medicine, this stuff is believed to have to feel no analysis. The villagers here do unused thermometers or blood pressure gauges. They place skullcap on the patient's forehead, then look into their eyes to measure the effect. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Now turn off the lights and let's relax together for tonight's journey. You walk along the slippery stone path that leads to the village's old church. It rises from the ground like a giant black stone monument, its cracks dotted with moss. Not the smooth green moss you see at the stream, but old, dark moss, as if it had seen too many unanswered prayers. Inside the church, the flickering light of a few old candles cast ominous shadows across the statue of Saint Joseph. You heard the wind howling through the broken glass, mixed with a faint rustling, like something was crawling under the tiles. You meet Father Emile, the old village priest. His face is pensive, his eyes strangely bright behind cracked glasses. "Have you come to find out?" he asks. "Or are you sick and don't know it?" You choose to remain silent. Father Emile leads you through the heavy wooden doors that lead down to the crypt. There, you find a spiral staircase so narrow that if someone were to walk behind you, they would be able to hear your heart beating. When the candlelight touched the last wall, you saw skulls. Dozens of them, not buried, not hidden. They were carefully placed in stone niches, each covered with a thin layer of moss. Some were dry white, some were still the moist ivory color of freshly plucked from the earth. You lean closer. The moss is velvety, a green with hints of brown, a color you've never seen in nature. It smells salty, not like dirt, not like moss. Closer, there's something like dried blood, but softer, lighter. "Don't sniff too closely," said Father Emile. "Skulwort holds the last breath. You don't know if it's a joke or not." But he doesn't laugh. Modern historians have confirmed that during times of plague and war, many communities developed mystical forms of healing, skullcap being one of them. It was quoted in Pharmacopoeia of London, the first English pharmaceutical book in 1680, and yes, people actually use skullcap moss to treat fever, epilepsy, and even demonic possession. You put your hand on a skull, feeling the moss cool like muscle pain cream. An old woman steps out of the shadows. "The baby had a seizure. I used moss from old Louis's skull. He was a healer. Now the baby sleeps soundly." You ask, "How do you know that moss works?" She smiled toothlessly. "Because it grows from people, know how to heal." You begin to understand. This is not simply a belief. This ice-living memory transmitted from humans to moss and then from moss back to humans. And you realize you've come to the right place. But are you ready to have a cold night yet? You don't sleep that night. After returning from the crypt, you sit in the makeshift living room at the back of the church, which used to be the vestry. The stone walls are cold. The wind beats slowly against the windows, as if someone is tapping you gently. Go down further. You wonder if what you see is just a superstitious ritual, or if there is something deeper something that science is reluctant to touch and religion is afraid to name? The next morning, Father Emile took his friend down into the cellar again. This time it was not just to look. If you want to understand moss, he said, you must know where it grows. You step deeper into the stone hallway you weren't allowed into last night. There are no candles. Just a small oil lamp that sways in his hand, casting shadows like human hands crawling across the ceiling. The musty smell grows. Not the moss of the woods, but the old damp smell of water dripping onto bones. You catch a faint metallic smell, like lead and rust mixed with human breath. And then you hear dripping, small dot dot, small dot dot, small. You come to a circular chamber deep beneath the church where the ground is soft and the ceiling is vaulted like an upside-down nest. In the middle of the room is a stone pedestal, and on it are dozens of human skulls each, covered in a different layer of moss. No two are alike. This is the main room, said Father Emile. We call it the Garden of Memory, you wonder. Why is it called garden? Because this is where memories grow, he replied, very softly, as if speaking any louder would kill the moss. You peer down at each skull. Some are covered in pale green moss, smooth as velvet. Some have just a single eyebrow-like streak of moss. Some have moss growing down the center of their heads like an ancient mohawk. You see a special skull. The moss on it is thicker and denser than anything else. And most surprisingly, it glows. Not exactly luminescent, but the more you stare at it, the more the light seems to bounce off it. You ask, what is this? Father Emile mused. The skull of Sister Marie. She died of tuberculosis, but for 10 years she was the only one who cured convulsions in 30 children in the area. They say that when she died, moss grew overnight. You don't ask how he knows, even though you really want to, because deep down you start to believe, not because of the evidence, but because of the way he said it and the way the moss appeared as part of the truth without explanation. Historians have fiercely debated the existence of skull moss chambers beneath churches. Some believe they are an exaggerated legend from European catacombs, where the moist air naturally causes moss to grow. But others believe there was deliberate intervention, choosing a wholly dead person, placing the skull in the right light and humidity to grow moss as a valuable medicine. You're still not sure which side to believe. But one thing is clear, the people here don't just collect moss. They take care of moss. You are handed a soft brush-old, gray goat hair. Father Emile tells you to dust the moss, but not the skull. You do so, your hand shaking slightly. As you touch the first layer of moss, a cool sensation runs down your arm into your shoulder blades. You don't know if it's real or just a fabrication of your mind. But you do know one thing. You don't want to hurt the moss. You ask, who was the last person to be cured? Father Emile said, a person who no longer believes. You're not sure who he's referring to, or perhaps he's referring to you. As you turn away, you catch a glimpse of some very thin Latin writing on the wall. You read part of it. Dying teaches. The dead still teach. You repeat the phrase over and over in your head. A mantra? A warning? Or a slogan for those who believe in a miracle cure grown from human bone memories. Anyway, you've come too far to turn back. You wake up with the scent of honey mixed with moss lingering in your nostrils. It's not a pleasant smell. It sticks to your throat like a musty curse. But to the villagers is the smell of hope, the smell of the only medicine that works when all else has failed. That morning, you follow an old woman named Margot to a small house on the edge of the village. Inside, a little boy lies curled up, sweating profusely, his eyes closed but his hands twitching. His mother sits by the bed, her face pale, and his father paces back and forth as if trying to ease his pain with his own steps. Margot calmly took a small box from her basket, containing a dark green, dough-like mixture. This is from Joseph's skull, she told her friend. He was the village chief for 13 years and never let anyone go hungry. The moss growing on his skull smells like smoke. Good for lost children. You don't ask why the smell of kitchen smoke cures seizures. Sometimes it's best not to ask. She rubs the mixture on the child's forehead, chest, and solace of his feet, whispering an old prayer, the mother cries. And you stand there trying to memorize every movement, every smell, every look. The baby will sleep, Margot said finally. If he remembers his name tomorrow, he'll be all right. You stay with them until late at night. The room quiets down, save for the crackling of the stove. The boy stops twitching, his lips move as if he's dreaming. You're not sure what's going on? But perhaps the most magical thing is the feeling that everyone believes this will work. That evening, you return to the church and find Father Emile. You ask, if moss grows on the skulls of good people, what use is moss on the skulls of bad people? He replied without thinking, for those who do not want to die alone. You shivered, partly at the words, partly at the way he looked at you as he said it. Modern historians still debate the true nature of this skull moss. Some believe it is a form of mass medical paranoia, like the burning of wormwood to ward off evil spirits. Others point out that many fungi and lichens actually have medicinal properties, and under certain conditions can grow on dried human tissue, creating natural medical structures. But the issue here is not just chemistry, it is faith. You recall a story Father Emile told the night before about a monk who volunteered to donate his head after his death, on the condition that the moss growing from his skull would only be used for people who never believed in miracles. And the strange thing is, he said, not a single moss ever grew from his skull. You ask, so he really left nothing behind? Not that, Emile chuckled. It's just that sometimes the head needs so much to grow moss ... It should be left alone. You leave the room, your head buzzing. Each story you hear adds a new layer, as if everything in this church is an unsolved puzzle. And then you begin to understand something. Moss is more than just a remedy, it's a map. It's a rearview mirror. It's proof that even in death, a person can be remembered, not by name, but by the impact they leave behind in every tiny root growing from their white bones. Do you remember the first time you touched that moss? The feeling hasn't gone away. And tonight you dream that your hands are covered in that moss, not disgusting, not terrifying, but like tapping into someone's memory and being remembered by them. You wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, not because of a nightmare, but because an image is still too vivid. Hundreds of skulls lined up, moss growing on them like hair, reaching out, clinging to your legs, dragging you down to the cold stone floor. You need answers. The next morning, you return to the church library. It's a place few people go to. Dusty shelves, dark leather prints, and manuscripts that the scribe must have written with a shake of his hand. You wipe the stone table with a rough cloth, then start flipping through the pages. You don't know what you're looking for, but then it finds you. A thin volume with no title on the cover, just a skull-shaped watermark. Inside is Latin text interspersed with geometric symbols, some like formulas, some like songs. You recognize a recurring phrase, moss from memory, moss memory. There is a rough translation. The moss that grows on the skulls of those who know too much may retain their last word, the last word. Not words. Not a will, language. You look up at the top shelf and pull out a book with a deerskin cover, filled with medieval medical records, mostly prescriptions. At the back of the book, under Adjunctive Therapies for Epilepsy, there's a handwritten note, moss from the skull of the initiated, applied to the temples, will quiet the echoes. You sit still. What is the echo? A voice in your head? Or memories too big to forget? Historians have debated this. Some believe that echoes are an old-fashioned term for psychosis delusions, delusions of hearing voices, or auditory hallucinations. Others argue that in an era without MR is or cognitive therapy, people use physical symbols to tap into the unconscious, and skullcaps were simply a way to decode fears in physical form. You begin to wonder, if memory is a physical thing, can it be transmitted? A strange theory in the book you read refers to something called environmental memory. That is, memories can leave biological imprints on the body. And moss, which feeds on dead organic matter, can eat those memories. It doesn't understand, but it keeps them. You stand up and walk quickly down the tunnel. This time, you don't need anyone to guide you. You find the same spot, the garden of memory, and examine the bedrock carefully. There are small channels that let rainwater in from outside. The humidity is maintained evenly. There are even traces of rotten fiber, perhaps grass or shrouds, that someone once spread around the skull to help moss grow faster. You suddenly realize this is no longer a memorial, this is ancient laboratory. Someone or generations didn't just believe in moss's healing powers. They studied it, recorded reactions, modified the environment, tested different types of skulls. This place was once the medical center of an unnamed religion. You pick up a small piece of wood from the corner of the wall. On it is carved a thin line of words. Remember the shape of moss? It always grows against fear. You sit down. Suddenly, everything you've seen, smelled, touched, starts to come together. Not as a complete story, but as a strange poem, tangled, dark, but very real. You leave the vault with a new feeling. Moss doesn't just grow from human skulls, but could be the result of what that person left unresolved, unanswered questions, wounds that never heal. The last screams were swallowed by the stone. And now you begin to suspect that you too are leaving something behind. With every breath, every glance you give the moss. Will someone pick your memories from that moss? Are you starting to grow moss from the inside? You start to notice time more. Not in a what time is it kind of way, but a vague feeling that day is repeating. The same morning light shining through the broken glass window. The same wind whistling through the stone corridor. The same musty, damp smell, so familiar you can't tell if you're really smelling it or just remembering it. You return to the garden of memories late in the afternoon, as the sun is retreating from the woods surrounding the church. Today, you decide to do something different. No touching, no asking. Just sit. You sit in the circle of mossy skulls as if you were in the middle of an ancient meeting. No one speaks, but you feel like you are being watched not by the empty eye sockets, but by the moss itself, which seems to bend with every breath you take. Then you see it, a small door hidden behind heavy ash curtains. Curious, you pull the curtains aside and discover a narrow staircase leading deeper down. No lights, no footprints, just dust and a very different smell. Earthy, fresh. You grab the flashlight from your pocket, the only 21st century thing you still have, and step down. Below was a small space, almost a cellar, but this was no place for skulls, no niche, no altar, just wooden shelves and dozens of glass jars filled with some kind of greenish-brown vial. Each jar had a different symbol on it, a spiral, a clenched fist, a flame. Each symbol was strange and abstract, as if someone had tried to encapsulate an emotion in a single letter. You open a jar. A musty smell hits your nose, rotten wood, fermented milk, and rusty iron. You notice there's moss in it, mixed with something like linseed oil or dried blood. And the note beside it reads, Model 43, Rebel Soldier Skull, 1432, used for sleepwalkers. You glance over at the other jars. Model 12 nun suspected of losing her mind after the epidemic. Sample 07, body buried in mountain rocks, moss cannot grow. You suddenly understand, this is Askell incubation room. Not where people wait for moss to grow naturally, but where moss is controlled, evaluated, and cultivated by default. You are no longer in a spiritual place. You are standing in the middle of a laboratory, except it is made of faith instead of data. You recall the ongoing academic debate. Is there clear evidence that skull moss has medicinal properties? Modern biologists dispute this since moss is incapable of absorbing memories. But anthropologists are not so sure. They ask the opposite question: what is memory? If the living transmit memories through voice, gestures, and eyes, why can't the dead transmit them through soil, moss, and bones? You look up at the ceiling and notice that each stone has faint markings like a code. You take a picture even though you're not sure you'll ever be able to decipher it. But this is no coincidence. Here, people tried to decipher memory, tried to force it to grow from death, tried to preserve understanding through layers of soft moss. And you start thinking about yourself. How many people have you forgotten in your life? How many stories have been forgotten simply because no one wrote them down? How many little facts, the way your mother made tea, the way your grandfather cleaned his glasses, have disappeared because no one remembers them? Perhaps the villagers are not crazy. They are just do not accept loss. You turn back to the first jar of moss you opened. Scrawled on the lid are the words, "Use on the first moonlit night." You don't know what that means. But you decide, if the moon rises tonight, you will try. Because if moss really does hold memories, you wonder, can you remember something that never happened to you? Moonrise, not the silvery moon of fairy tales, but a pale, blurred glow, like ink smeared on old sacramental paper. The moonlight filtered through the cracks in the stone, making the church seem more illuminated by vague nostalgia than by real light. You return to the Garden of Memories, bringing with you the moss jar marked for use on the first moonlit night. Strangely enough, no one stopped you. Father Emile did not appear. No, Madame Margot, no one in the village asked what you were going to do. It seemed that everyone knew that, at some point, everyone would have touches the memories you want to remember. You sit in the middle of the room, opening the jar. The smell is the same as before, sour, metallic, and as old as a dream from before you were born. You take some moss from the jar and rub it on your temples like Grandma Margot did with the child. It's cold, not like ice or wind, but cold from within, like when you flip through an old photo of a dead relative and suddenly smelling. Room smell 2001, nothing happens for the first few minutes. Then you see, not with your eyes exactly, in your mind, in your flesh, in your heartbeat. An image pops up as clear as film, a middle-aged man, thinning hair, calloused hands. He sits on a bench in a stone room, holding a leather book. He says nothing, but you understand. He was the man who once owned that skull. You don't see the memory, wean memory. He put his hand on your head, not the real you, but the you in his memory. Then he pointed to the window. Outside was a field of cornflowers and snow. A feeling wells up, loneliness, not sadness, but the kind of loneliness that only someone who has lost all their friends in war can understand. Then you see he's written something in the book, and you know it matters even if you can't read it. You wake up suddenly, still in the garden of memories. The moonlight has shifted away from the window. You touch your temples. The moss has dried as if it had never been applied. You breathe heavily. Friend was in someone else's memory. Or are you imagining it all? Psychologists still debate the effect. Primed memory. When you believe too much in an image, your brain builds the rest. But there is something about this experience that doesn't feel like a hallucination. It's like I just borrowed someone else's memory for a very small moment. You decide to try it again. This time it's a different bottle, letter writer's skull. You rub it on your wrist where they say your emotional pulse is strongest. The image comes faster, a room strewn with parchment. A man writing without proofreading. Each word seems to fall from his hand. In your mind, fragments of poetry echo a love letter, an indictment, a diary entry. You see him pause, smile faintly. Then he tears the page apart. You know why? He writes down everything other people want to say, but no one ever asks. Grandfather want to say something, you wake up again. You feel like you've lived two lives in one night. And you begin to understand. Moss isn't medicine, it's window. Every time you use it, you open a path to unheard souls. You go back to the incubator, turn over each jar. Look at each symbol. It's like you're reading a medical record, not to treat the disease, but to cure it. Memory. You put each jar back more carefully than ever. And in that moment, you understand. You didn't come here to take anything away. You came here to keep it. Record it. Listen. As you step out of the cellar, the moonlight has receded. A strand of dry moss falls from your hand, but you catch it. Not as a proof, but as a promise. That one day, if you too become a skull, someone will sit in the garden of memories and feel you lived, felt, dreamed. And you will also grow moss. You start being called Moss Keeper. No one officially appointed you as such. There was no ceremony, no baptism, no certificate. Just one by one, people in the village started asking you for little favors. My daughter has trouble sleeping. Can you see if there's any moss that can help? Or, my grandmother is afraid of forgetting. Is there any kind of moss that can help her memory? You never say for sure. But you learn to listen, not to the words, but to the silences after the story, where the real memories lie, wiggling like young roots waiting to grow. One afternoon, you sit on the back steps of the church, holding an old notebook in your hand, where you begin to write down every jar of moss you've ever tried. The numbers, the smells, the sensations, the images that come up, and sometimes the emotions that you can't name. The notebook became a moss diary. You wrote, Sample 21, smell of burning wood and tears. Could have been someone who died in a fire. No image, just a steady sigh. After 3 minutes, felt sad without knowing why. You find yourself no longer looking for answers. You are doing something else. Build a bridge for unspoken memories. Then one day, Father Emile asked you to follow him to the cemetery out back. Not the crypt, but the old plot where they buried those who didn't qualify for the Garden of Memory. Those who were too poor, too unknown, or simply whose names no one remembered. He pointed to an empty tomb. When the time comes, he said, I want to be left here. No skull, no moss. No memories to be left. You look at him in silence. It is the first time you see him not as a custodian of a ritual, but as a man tired of carrying too many nameless things all his life. You ask, so all that we do, is it really to preserve the dead? Or to make the living less afraid? He did not answer immediately. He just sat down beside the grave, his hand tracing the moss growing on the nearby rock. It could be both, he said, or neither. But if touching the moss reminds a child of his dead father, or makes a mother believe her child will survive, isn't that enough? You understand, this is not a place of certainty. This is a place of sympathy, patient, and allowing the strange to exist without explanation. Scholars will debate for centuries about biology, psychology, folk beliefs. But you, with your hands that have caressed moss, walked between breath and memory, you no longer need definitions. One day a boy came to see you. My grandfather died a long time ago, he said, but my mother still cries when she hears his music. Is there any moss that will make her miss him less? You smile sadly. Yes, you say, but you shouldn't use it. The boy frowned. Why? Because there are things we should not cure, you replied, but rather keep as the softest part of our hearts. You are not a healer. You are not a shaman. You are just someone who listens to memories through the moss, and sometimes passes them on to others in the softest form, a story, a touch, a closing of the eyes. That evening you rub some moss on your wrist not because you need answers, but because you want to. Sleep with a memory that does not belong to you. And as you fall asleep, you hear someone whispering in your ear, "Thank you for not forgetting." You don't know who it is. Could be Marie, the nun. Could be the soldier of 1432. Could be a child who never had a name. But you smile in your sleep. Because memories, in the end, don't need to Bebelong Toto exist. Your last night in the nameless village begins with the ringing of a bell. No one knows who is ringing it. You wake up, not from fear, but from a strange feeling, as if sleep itself has signaled the end of something. You sit up, open the door, and see the moon, this time full and bright enough that you can see the moss on the stone a dozen meters away. You have no plans for the night, but your feet lead you back to the church, then down into the cellar, then to the familiar room where all the moss jars are stacked like untold secrets. You pick up a jar at random, no notes, no markings, an empty jar. And, this Ismi-owned jar, you don't remember when you left it there, but apparently it was waiting for you. You sit down, open the jar, and there's no smell. There was just a quiet space. You hesitate. You take a bit of the mixture inside moss, dirt, or ash, it's unclear, and rub it against your temples. Nothing happens in the first minute. Then you see a field of grass stretching, no one, no sound. You stand there alone, no fear, no sadness, just silence. Then you hear footsteps eerily familiar. You at 8 years old, 15 years old, 27 years old, and now. All looking at you, no blame, no words. Just standing there as if waiting for you to realize something that has been forgotten in the time between. And then each of you melted into the grass. Not disappearing, but dissolving like the last memory returning to its source. You understand that jar does not contain anyone else's memories. It sucked memories from you, and now you are leaving behind a little moss, which will grow on your skull when the time comes. You return to your room, and for the first time in weeks, you sleep without dreaming about anyone else. The next morning you leave the village, no one to see me off, no one to hold me back. But you don't leave empty-handed. In your backpack you carry your moss diary, a dry root pressed between 2 pages, and a few sentences you hear every time the weather gets foggy. Memories don't die, they just change form. You will tell this story to someone or not. Maybe you'll let it grow moss in your heart. Then one day, someone else touches and knows that you lived, that you listened, that you did not forget. Your story, a stranger who visits a village with a strange church where people heal with. Moss growing from human skulls begins as a folk tale and ends as a haunting inner journey. You venture into a world of memory, faith, and unanswerable questions. Can memories be physically preserved? Does moss growing on skulls retain something invisible? You don't just observe, you experience, from strange jars of moss to recurring dreams, from encounters with priests and villagers to journeys into other people's memories. Moss is more than just a plant. It becomes a symbol of the unexplained, of nameless memories, of silent listening. You become a moss keeper, not because someone appointed you, but because you chose to listen to what others did not see. And in the end, you also leave a part of yourself, not in words, but in your presence in a nameless jar of moss, waiting to grow from the quietest place. You have come to the end of the story. Now is the time to take a deep breath. Let your eyes close naturally, and let the silent images that have just passed of stone arches, moss jars, wordless memories fade into sleep. If tonight you dream of a long corridor covered with soft moss, or hear someone's footsteps passing through your mind but you can't see their face, don't be afraid. Maybe it's just an old memory from someone who lived long before you, visiting you in your dreams. Or maybe you're dreaming about yourself, a version of yourself you've forgotten. growing back from deep within in a completely new form. Whatever, have a peaceful night. Sleep well.